In the wake of the Titans, the world is forever changed, leaving behind a legacy of power and sacrifice. Explore the epic stories of leadership and the long shadows cast by those who dared to lead. Hit subscribe now and follow the path of the legends today.
The envelope was already sitting at my place when I walked into the restaurant, not on the table in general, not near the breadbasket or tucked beside the centerpiece, at my specific seat, the one my mother had texted me about 3 days earlier. "We reserved your usual spot, sweetheart, the one by the window you always liked as a kid." I remember reading that text and thinking it was a nice thing to say. I remember feeling something close to warmth. The envelope killed that feeling before I even sat down. My brother was watching me from across the table. He had this look on his face, not the look of someone who just pulled off something clever, but the look of someone who thought he had. There's a difference. One is dangerous. The other is almost sad. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope and why a man in a dark gray suit was sitting at the bar nursing a club soda and watching our table, I want you to leave a comment and tell me something. Have you ever been the one in your family who got written off? Not in a dramatic blow up at Thanksgiving way. Just quietly. Gradually. Like water wearing down stone until one day you look up and realize you've been erased. Because that's what happened to me. And it happened so slowly I almost didn't notice. My name is not important. What matters is this. I am 31 years old. I have a younger brother named Jonah. And for most of my life, Jonah has been the sun that my parents orbit. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I said it with bitterness for a long time. Through high school, through college, through the years when I was building something, while everyone in my family was asking Jonah about his weekend plans. I've metabolized it now. It's just a fact. The way the weather is a fact. Jonah is charming and loud, and he fills a room in a way I never did, and my parents respond to that the way most people do, with attention, with money, with the assumption that he is the one who needs to be taken care of. I was always the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who figured things out without asking. My mother used to say it like a compliment. "You've always been so independent, you never needed us the way Jonah does." She meant it kindly. She didn't understand that what she was actually saying was, "We stopped worrying about you, which means we stopped thinking about you." I left our hometown in rural Ohio at 22. I had a business degree, $4,300 in a savings account, and an idea I'd been turning over in my head since my junior year. It wasn't a glamorous idea. It wasn't an app or a platform or anything that would make a good pitch deck. It was a data management company for mid-sized healthcare providers. The kind of back-end infrastructure work that nobody talks about at dinner parties but that every single hospital system desperately needs. I called it Meridian Health Systems. I incorporated it in Delaware. I worked out of a studio apartment in Charlotte for the first 2 years, eating cereal for dinner more times than I'd like to admit. I didn't tell my family how serious it was getting, partly because they didn't ask. Jonah had just gotten his real estate license, and that was the topic of every call home for about 8 months. Partly because I'd learned, somewhere along the way, that talking about my plans to my family before they worked out was a reliable way to have my plans talked out of me. My mother worried. My father second-guessed. And Jonah had a specific gift for finding the weakest point in any idea you shared with him and pressing on it, not to be cruel, just because that was how he engaged with the world. So I stopped sharing. By the time I was 27, Meridian had 42 employees and contracts with 6 regional hospital networks across the Southeast. By 29, we were in 14 states. I had a business partner, a woman named Sylvia, who I'd met at a conference in Atlanta and who understood the industry in a way that made me a better founder just by proximity. Together, we built something that neither of us had fully expected to build. When the acquisition offer came from a larger health technology firm out of Boston, I was 30 years old. Sylvia and I had talked about an exit for about a year at that point. We were tired. Not of the work, but of the pace. Of the weight of it. The offer was $840 million. After negotiations, after legal fees, after Sylvia's stake in the equity we'd given our early employees, my personal payout was $310 million. I want to say that number out loud one more time because I still find it strange to hear myself say $310 million. I didn't tell my family. I told exactly 4 people: Sylvia, my attorney, my accountant, and the therapist I'd started seeing the year before because I'd been having panic attacks and needed somewhere to put things. That was it. My mother called me that same week to ask if I needed her to send my old winter coat because she'd heard Charlotte was getting cold. I said sure, that would be great, thanks. I went home for Thanksgiving that year. I sat at the same table I'd sat at since I was a child. I ate my grandmother's sweet potato casserole. I listened to Jonah talk for 40 minutes about a commercial property deal he was trying to put together. A strip mall in Dayton he was convinced was going to be his big break. Nobody asked me what I'd been doing. At one point, my mother patted my hand and said, "It's so nice you were able to get away from work for a few days. I know things have been slow for you." I nodded. I said yes, it had been a busy year. Things had not been slow. The dinner last April was my brother's idea. He called me in late March. He was warm on the phone, warmer than usual, and I noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure before a storm. He said the family was getting together at a restaurant in Columbus, a nice place, not our usual spot. He made a reservation. He said it had been too long. He said Mom and Dad were getting older and we should make more of an effort. All of that was true. None of it was the reason for the call. I found out the real reason 2 days later when my cousin Adele texted me out of nowhere. Adele, who I hadn't spoken to in almost a year, asking if I was doing okay and if I'd talked to anyone about Grandma Ruth's estate lately. I told her I hadn't. She said she thought I should, soon, before the dinner. Adele is not subtle. She was trying to warn me. I called her back and she told me what she knew, which wasn't everything, but was enough. Jonah had been talking to my parents about Grandma Ruth's house. Grandma Ruth had passed the previous October and she'd left her estate, the house about 6 acres outside of Columbus, and a modest investment account to be divided equally between me and Jonah. It was in the will. 30 minutes with an estate attorney had confirmed it was airtight, but Jonah had been telling my parents that the house was too valuable to split, and that a buyout didn't make sense, and that the logical thing would be for me to deed my half to him in exchange for a token payment. He'd been framing it as doing me a favor. According to Adele, he'd been saying things like, "She doesn't even live here. What does she want with a house in Ohio? And I'm the one who's going to develop it. She'd just sit on it and," this is the part that made me put down my coffee, "she's not in a position financially to fight this." He thought I needed the money. He thought I couldn't afford a legal battle. He had been telling my parents for months that the kindest thing for everyone would be if I just signed my share over to him. I sat with that information for about 48 hours. Then I called my attorney. Then I called a forensic accountant who specialized in estate disputes. Then I made one other call, to a man I'd been introduced to through a mutual connection in Charlotte. Someone who did a specific kind of corporate investigation work that I won't describe in detail here, except to say that within a week, I knew a great deal more about my brother's finances than he knew I knew. What I found was not entirely surprising, but was, in its specifics, worse than I'd expected. Jonah's strip mall deal in Dayton had not gone well. He had personally guaranteed a loan he could not repay. He owed more than $200,000 to a private lender who was, at that point, losing patience. The commercial property he'd been describing at Thanksgiving as his big break had been listed for sale twice in the previous year without finding a buyer. He needed Grandma Ruth's land. He needed it badly. And his plan, apparently, was to walk me into a nice restaurant, put papers in front of me, and use 30 years of family dynamics. The same dynamics that had always made me the easy one, the accommodating one, the one who didn't make a fuss, to get me to sign. I thought about calling him. I thought about calling my parents. I thought about a lot of things. Instead, I called my attorney and asked her to prepare some documents of my own. The restaurant was the kind of place that had cloth napkins and a sommelier. My brother had chosen, well, neutral ground. Public enough that nobody was going to raise their voice, formal enough that everyone would feel pressure to behave. I could see the logic of it. In a different version of this story, it might have worked. I arrived 10 minutes early. The hostess took me to the table and there it was, the envelope, white, business-sized, sitting on top of the folded napkin at my seat. I picked it up. I did not open it. I set it on the table in front of me and I ordered a glass of water and I waited. My parents arrived together. My mother hugged me and told me I looked thin. My father shook my hand the way he always does, firm and brief, the handshake of a man who learned to show affection through practicality. Jonah came in 2 minutes later with his wife, Dana. She gave me a tight smile. She knew. Of course she knew. We ordered. We talked about my cousin's new baby and my mother's garden and a news story my father had been following. It was pleasant. It was almost normal. I could feel Jonah waiting for his moment the way you feel a tooth that needs pulling. There's a dull pressure and you keep finding yourself reaching for it with your tongue. He got there around the time the entrees arrived. He said, "So, there's actually something we wanted to talk about tonight. About Grandma Ruth's estate." He said it like it was a natural segue, like it was just practical business, no big deal. My mother looked at her plate. My father looked at Jonah. I looked at the envelope. He explained it the way Adele had described. The land would be more valuable whole. A split didn't make financial sense. He had plans for it, a developer he'd been talking to. He said he wanted to do right by me, that he put together something fair, that the envelope had a deed transfer document and a check for $5,000 as a good faith payment. $5,000. For half of a 6-acre property outside Columbus that had been appraised 18 months earlier at a little over $2 million. I picked up the envelope. I looked at it. I set it back down. I said, "I appreciate you putting this together." He relaxed. That was the tell. His shoulders dropped maybe half an inch, and he reached for his wine glass, and I understood that he had genuinely believed on some level that this was going to be easy. That I was going to be the person he decided I was, practical, accommodating, financially desperate, not in a position to push back. I reached into my bag and placed my own folder on the table. It was a plain manila folder, nothing dramatic about it. I slid it across the table toward him and I said I had my attorney put something together as well. He looked at the folder like it had appeared from nowhere. What was in my folder was this, a full appraisal of Grandma Ruth's property, commissioned 6 weeks earlier. A letter from my state attorney outlining my legal rights under Ohio probate law, a copy of a complaint that had been filed 3 days prior with the Ohio Division of Real Estate regarding certain representations Jonah had made to a client in the previous year, and, on top of all of it, a single-page document summarizing the outstanding loan he'd personally guaranteed in connection with the Dayton property. I didn't put those documents there to be cruel. I put them there because I needed him to understand, clearly and without any room for interpretation, that I was not the version of me he'd been counting on. The man at the bar had stood up. He walked over slowly, not rushing, and he handed Jonah a small envelope of his own. Process service for a civil matter. The private lender had, it turned out, filed suit the previous week. Jonah hadn't been served yet. He was served now. The table was quiet. My mother put down her fork. My father looked at me, not at Jonah, at me, with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It took me a moment to identify it. It was the look of a man recalibrating. Jonah said my name. He said it twice. I said, "The deed transfer is not something I'm going to sign. The property will be sold, as outlined in Grandma Ruth's will, and the proceeds divided equally. I've already spoken to an estate attorney and a realtor. The listing will go live next month unless you'd like to discuss a legitimate buyout at fair market value." He started to say something about family, about how this wasn't what Grandma Ruth would have wanted, about how I was making this harder than it needed to be. I let him finish. Then I said, "I've been making things easy for 29 years. I'm done with that." My father called me the next morning. He called early, 6:53, which for him meant he hadn't slept well. I almost didn't answer. I had already decided that I was not going to spend the next 3 months managing everyone's feelings about what had happened. But I answered. He didn't apologize. My father is not built for apologies, not directly, not in words. What he said was, "I want you to know that I didn't know about the loan. Your mother didn't know either. He told us the Dayton deal was still in progress." I said I understood that. He said, "I don't know when I stopped asking you how things were going." I didn't say anything for a few seconds. Outside my window, it was early and gray, and the street was quiet. I said, "It was gradual." He said, "Yeah." A pause. "I think you're right about the estate." Another pause, longer. "I think you've been right about a lot of things for a long time." That was as close as we were going to get, at least for now. I told him I'd come home in June. He said okay. He said he'd tell my mother. We hung up. The property sold in July. It took 9 weeks to find the right buyer, a young couple who wanted the land for a small organic farm, which is not what Jonah had envisioned for it, but which felt to me like the most fitting outcome possible. My share of the proceeds cleared into my account on a Thursday afternoon. I was in a meeting when I got the notification. I finished the meeting. Jonah and I have not spoken since the restaurant. I don't know if that's permanent. I don't know if I want it to be. What I know is that I needed to stop being the person who smoothed things over in order to keep a peace that only ever benefited the people who weren't doing the smoothing. My mother calls every Sunday now. She asks actual questions about my work, about the city I live in, about what I've been reading. The calls last longer than they used to. Last week, she asked if I had a good financial advisor, and I said yes, a very good one. And she said, "Good. I always worry about you being so far away and handling everything alone." And I said, "Mom, I promise I'm okay." And she said, "I know. I just want to hear you say it. I am okay. I am more than okay." I just stopped waiting for the people who loved me to figure that out on their own and started being honest about it myself. There's a version of this story where I walk into that restaurant and I sign the envelope and I take the $5,000 check and I tell myself that family peace is worth more than an acre of inherited land. I understand that version of me. She was me for a long time, but she was also the version of me that my brother was counting on. And the thing about being underestimated by someone who is supposed to know you, really know you, for your entire life, is that eventually it stops being their failure and starts being your permission. Permission to stop explaining yourself. Permission to be prepared. Permission to slide your own folder across the table. I never told my family what I'd built. I never told them what was in my accounts, what I'd sold, what I was worth on paper. I still haven't. Not because I'm hiding it. I'm not hiding it anymore. But because I realized something sitting at that restaurant watching my brother's shoulders drop when he thought he'd won. The people who love you should not need to know how much money you have in order to treat you with respect. That's it. That's the whole lesson. I didn't need them to be impressed. I needed them to see me, and when they didn't, I stopped waiting for it and started building something so solid that eventually, when they finally looked, there would be no way to look away. The envelope is still on my kitchen counter, actually. The one with the deed transfer and the $5,000 check. I never gave it back. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe as a reminder of what I was asked to sign away. Maybe just to remember what it felt like to slide my folder across the table instead. I've thought a lot about what made Jonah believe it would work. And honestly, I don't think he's a bad person in the way that word usually gets used. I think he looked at me and saw the same person he'd always seen, the quiet one, the one who left, the one who never asked for anything, and therefore must not have anything worth fighting for. He built his entire plan on a version of me that stopped being accurate years ago. That's not evil. That's just the consequence of never paying attention, and I have to be honest with myself about my part in it. I made it easy for a long time. I showed up at Thanksgiving and nodded along and let conversations move past me without correcting the record. Every time I chose silence over clarity, I was confirming the story they'd already decided to tell about me. I don't regret building quietly. I think that was right for me, and I'd do it again. But there's a difference between privacy and invisibility, and somewhere along the way, I'd let one become the other. What I've come to understand is that how people treat you is almost always a direct reflection of what you've allowed them to believe about you. Not your fault necessarily, but your responsibility to correct. Jonah didn't conjure his assumptions out of nowhere. He assembled them from years of data I provided. By never pushing back, never claiming space, never saying, "Actually, let me tell you what I've been doing." The dinner at that restaurant was the logical conclusion of a pattern I participated in. That's not comfortable to admit. It's also just true. The folder I brought that night wasn't really about the property. I mean, I wasn't going to sign away $1 million asset for $5,000. That was never happening. But the folder was also something else. It was the first time in my adult life that I walked into a room with my family and said, without words, "I know exactly what's happening here, and I came prepared." That felt different from every other family gathering I'd attended. It felt like finally occupying the full space of who I actually was, instead of shrinking into the version they found easiest to manage. My father's call the next morning mattered more to me than the property sale. He didn't say much, he rarely does, but what he said was real. "I don't know when I stopped asking you how things were going." I've replayed that sentence probably 50 times since then. Not because it hurt, though it did, a little, but because it was honest. And honesty from someone who's been operating on autopilot for years is genuinely rare and genuinely worth something. Intelligence without integrity is just clever manipulation. I watched Jonah construct a scheme that was, in its way, fairly well designed. The venue, the timing, the framing, and it amounted to nothing because it was built on taking from someone who hadn't agreed to give. All that effort, all that planning, and it collapsed the moment it met someone who'd prepared harder and longer and with cleaner intentions. That's not luck. That's what happens when you build something solid versus something expedient. I'm not the family disappointment. I never was. I was just the one they forgot to look at closely enough. And now they're looking. That's enough for me.